Hey everyone, welcome to On the Edge. I am Rayanne Thorn Krueger. I am the host and producer of this live stream broadcast. It's also available on demand. So if you enjoy what you see or hear today or have learned from it, please share it out. We hope you will gain a great deal from what we're going to talk about today. My very special guest and good friend is Crystal Lay. I'm getting used to not saying the Miller part. Welcome, Crystal. Really, really happy to have you here today. Crystal has an amazing story and accomplishment that she's going to share with us, but then we're going to jump into a conversation that's close to my heart for a number of reasons. We'll get into that later, but we're going to talk about hidden disabilities. And first, Crystal, though, I would love for you to tell us all about yourself and what you've been doing lately.
Right on. Okay. The elevator pitch that everybody is so much easier to talk about somebody else than yourself, right? But
That's true. That's true.
But to that end, so I am Crystal Lay. Crystal Lay. I answer to both.
Okay, good.
So I run GBS, which is an end-to-end talent attraction agency. We focus primarily on employer branding, recruitment marketing, setting up the top of funnel into onboarding solutions for organizations. But we also, because of the work that I've been doing over the last few years that we'll be talking about today, work with organizations on how to build more neuro-inclusive and more just inclusive work sites, right? And so when we look at the vast spectrum of people, there are a lot of different types of people that make a good work environment, right? But we build for just one type of people, and it's the typical, right? And so
Right.
that leaves a lot of people out, and it's bothered me for many years. But over the pandemic, when people were learning how to bake sourdough bread and doing all sorts of cool things that I'm very jealous of, and not that at all, I went, oh, you know what? I want to start researching this problem and see how we can work through this, because the shakeup of all of that was just so enormous. When people went from barely hanging on to structures that they had kind of cobbled together over the years in a work environment to suddenly being thrust to working at home all of the time without any of the supports that they knew and understood, whether they were great or horrible, it doesn't really matter. They were just gone. That was a massive shift. And we saw a lot of fractures in mental health. And so I wanted to understand what was the impact of that. And in doing so, I recognized our system was really broken even before the pandemic, and it was serving people even less so after. And so I've spent the last few years studying that and looking at how to improve the gaps that exist for those with hidden disabilities.
So I love this topic for a number of reasons. It's been part of my learning over the last several years that I've done about diversity, just understanding diversity and how important it is. And on my own learning path, my own learning journey has included neurodiversity. And the other reason is because I was recently, as an old lady, we'll just call myself an old lady, diagnosed with ADHD. And throughout my career and life, it's benefited me. I always thought of my ability to get a lot done and to have several things going was a superpower, right? It was my superpower. And I have to get back to that because part of my issues came as a result of the pandemic. Also with the aging process, when I've had to slow down because of any kind of physical ailment, whether it was when I broke my wrist last year that required 2 different surgeries over a 6-month period. And then I recently had a hip replacement. All of those things slowed me physically down. And then I started noticing this, okay, what's going on with my brain? I don't feel well. I don't feel like I'm accomplishing what I need. I look around and I feel like I'm lazy. I'm super lazy. I procrastinate. I have all of these things. And I was also dealing with sleeplessness and dread, the feeling of dread, which are, if you're a woman of a certain age, those are also in line with menopause, right? So I had these several things going on. I had menopause going on and the realization that something else was going on with me. And I went through the whole diagnosis process, right? And was diagnosed with ADHD as a woman in her late 50s.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good place to kind of pause for a second and say, that's kind of the first issue. Now, conversely, I was fortunate, and I'm going to say fortunate is a weird thing to say fortunate with, but I was fortunate to have been diagnosed with ADHD at like age 6 or 7, somewhere in there. Um, when you can't sit down and you're trying to teach the class with the teacher, which might also be part of my personality. So there's that. But but and you just can't
Guilty.
can't sit down. The school will tell your parents, hey, you need to go get this looked at. Right. So that's kind of how that happened. But so I've known for a really long time. And as a result, I was able to build, with the help of psychologists and really great therapists over the years, coping mechanisms that weren't necessarily medication. Although there's nothing wrong with medication. And I use
Right.
that to a different point, right? Medication can help you at certain times. But to be really successful, you have to build patterns and coping mechanisms and tools to be able to deal with the weaknesses in your executive functioning for ADHD specifically, right? And so I was able to build that during my formative years. But for many, many people with neurodivergence, they don't find out about it until they're an adult. And quite often, just like with climate change and other things that are absolutely real, you end up with adults who don't understand it. And so they deny its existence. Right. And so they'll tell people, oh, adult ADHD isn't real. That's not a thing.
Right.
Neurodivergence isn't real. That's not a thing. That's stupid. Like, I'm
Right.
sorry, it's just stupid. And people who say that are just, they don't understand. And so unfortunately, there are too many people who don't get the help they need because they hear that kind of thing from someone. They don't have a supportive boss. They don't have supportive home lives. And so they just don't get the help they need. And that's unfortunate. I'm glad you're not one of those people. But when we
Yeah,
look at,
it's ignorance. It's also a way to keep the status quo. I'm better than you. I'm, all of these things. So when we talk about hidden disabilities, I don't want to get caught in my thing.
yeah,
Although I will tell you this: in kindergarten, my teacher pulled my parents aside and said, they basically told her and she said this, she's retarded. You need to take her to somebody and have her diagnosed. And in kindergarten, I went to see a series of psychiatrists, and the final note was that she's smarter than the teacher, get her in a different class. That's what they told my parents. So that's where it ended. They just
yeah,
found me a new kindergarten class. There was no, learning further. And my
right.
parents had 2 boys before me and then 2 boys after me. And it was like, she's normal compared to the 4 rambunctious boys, right? So that's my story. And it's been an
Yeah.
interesting story, but everybody has their own story. And I want to talk about beyond ADHD and tell me,
Yes.
what are hidden disabilities? Let's talk about this first, and then we'll go to
I'm
the next.
Yeah, I'm so glad that was where I was going to go next. So when we look at hidden disabilities, there's really 2 sections to it. So one is neurodivergence. I'm going to finish there. The other is actual medical illnesses and conditions that you
Okay.
can't see. And
Okay.
both fall under hidden disabilities. So things like lupus, for example, very real. Thyroid conditions, Hashimoto's, et cetera. Like, these are all illnesses that absolutely affect and impact our ability to function and need accommodation in the workplace, but you can't see it. And so, quite often, the experience and the treatment that workers who have these conditions are met with is, it's not real, right? Or this is an excuse to be able to justify not being able to perform to the level at which you were hired. And that's unfortunate, right? Because they are real. But you can't see it, so it's hard to understand. The other is neurodivergence, and neurodivergence is, strictly speaking, variations in brain functioning and processing. So neurodivergence celebrates, and I use celebrate intentionally, differences like ADHD, autism, dyslexia as natural and unique occurrences, much like diverse smartphone features, right? So, it's not something that's wrong or needs fixing. It's just different. And we're still learning quite a lot about the neurodivergent brain. And take autism as an example. What
Right.
we're learning about the brain with autism is that it literally physically is different than a brain without autism. And so where what we would call a neurotypical brain, which, by the way, that term in and of itself is becoming outdated, but where that brain might have ridges, a brain with autism has smoothness. And where that brain is smooth, a brain with autism has ridges. And so there's still like, I
Wow.
can't tell you why that is because they're still learning that. Like there's still so much we don't understand, but it's a variation in the brain. It's not like a nervous condition that needs curing. And that was the way that it was treated for quite some time. So this is a naturally occurring thing. And it's really from a construct, neurodiversity is still in its infancy. It's less than 50 years old. There's not even a universally accepted definition of it
Right.
yet. So
Right.
that makes it very, very difficult for employers to understand and act upon because, academics and medical researchers can't even like agree on what it is. Right. So how do you then put it into action in employment? But it is something that regardless of how you define it specifically, you can just recognize that there's a diverse spectrum of functioning, neurologically speaking, and that's natural and it's to the benefit of society. So, to the point where you're like, hey, I always saw this as my superpower. Every single condition that or label that falls underneath neurodivergence has superpower with it. Dyscalculia has increased verbal skills and innovative thinking, dyspraxia, increase in verbal skills, empathy, intuition, acquired neurodiversity, because by the way, neurodiversity isn't necessarily something you're born with. PTSD it can also be classified
Right.
as a neuro disability or neurodiversity. Adaptability, empathy, Tourette syndrome tends to have higher levels of observational skills and often higher levels of cognitive control as they learn to control spontaneous utterances. So and then ADHD, creativity, hyperfocus, energy, passion. So there's lots of different advantages that can be harnessed within an organization and an individual with each of these things. But to get something good, no matter what it is in life, to get something good, you also have to deal with the weakness, right? That every coin has two sides. And so you can't expect to benefit from something that you're not willing to work through, if that makes sense.
My husband always says, just to bank off the two coins, there is no pancake thin enough that it doesn't have another side.
Right.
Right. So we have to be aware of these things. And I'm so glad that you brought up the hidden physical ailments. I have my sister-in-law suffers from lupus, and it would be really easy to look at what she struggles with and say, oh, she just needs to get up and go. She
Mhm.
just needs to exercise. All these things that if we aren't aware of the condition or what comes along with the label, we tend to not really fully understand the impact. And I just love that you have taken the time in your life to learn about these things and understand a little bit more and become an expert. And Crystal has a lot of research that's going to be published, so we're going to be sharing that in the future after
Mhm.
it's published, and we'll have her back on the show to talk about that. I think this is such an important topic. And
There's a
before we move
couple
forward, go ahead. Go ahead.
I would say there's a couple of things that has been shared publicly that I can share that I think kind of leads into where you're probably going to go next.
Okay.
And that's looking at the prevalence of this, right? So when we look at neurodiversity, we kind of move through like hidden disabilities in general, and we kind of move through how much does this really matter? Neurodiversity is something that people talk about, right? Like we want to have neurodiversity in our organization. So I think we need to look at like, hey, one, neurodiversity is the output, like that's the outcome of
Right.
everything we do. So from a label and discussion perspective, the terminology really matters. And one thing that we can all do that's very low lift is just understand how to talk about hidden disabilities. And so when we're talking about something that's medical, like lupus or something to that, that's a medical model that's pathologizing, right? There are limiters to that. There's an intervention focused model around that, right? If I have a B12 deficiency, that is something that can absolutely keep me from being able to fully work. Right now, I can take injections or vitamins or whatever and just kind of overcome some of that, but I may suffer from fatigue, memory loss, fuzzy
Right.
thinking,
Right.
inability to fully form sentences. There's a whole host of things, right? So that's something that would fall underneath a medical modality. When you're looking at neurodivergence, that is a accessibility or social model. That's how we need to approach that. And so what does that mean? That means we're looking at how to overcome the barriers that society presents around that, right? So what challenges are presented in a workplace, in an educational setting, in a medical office, in cultural barriers, et cetera. How can we overcome that so this person can live their best life, perform to their highest level, whatever that may be? And so the terminology around that is someone, an individual, me, you, we're neurodivergent, right? So that's an individual. When we're talking about how to help someone overcome those barriers, or how to accommodate them in the workforce, or help them as belong and psychologically attached to our organization, what we're talking about is neuro inclusion, right? And so that's referring to the efforts that we're making to include all employees to belong, regardless of their neurotype or their disability status, right? So the output of that then is neurodiversity. And why does that matter? Because if you talk about things in terms of neurodiversity, you are doing to the individual what everyone does, which is basically dehumanizing them, right? And you're focusing on their disability instead of them as a person. And no
Focusing
one
on
wants
the
to be
label.
that way. Right.
Focusing on the label. I have a quick story to talk about the labels. My youngest daughter, when she was she was only 2 or 3 years old, was developing speech patterns, right?
Mhm.
So hadn't learned to read yet, and she was mixing up, like a lot of kids do, mixing up syllables, like mazagine instead of magazine, right? Or Pischetti instead of spaghetti. Well, it was carrying over into sentence formation. She was saying, another one that was really funny was shun low instead of lotion. And so to this day, we still call it shun low when we're past the shun low. But she would mix up words in sentences. And I went and had her, did a diagnosis or I don't know. She sat down and spoke with not the psychologist, but it was somebody at the elementary school where my kids went, and said, I'm seeing some things, and they had a preschool for children that were neurodivergent. That's not what they called it then. I can't, maybe special needs, maybe that's what they called it then. And they did just a little bit of testing and said, yes, she has dyslexia, but it's not severe, and don't tell anyone, because it will inhibit her growth. They will label her, and that label will stay with her all through high school. And so I often look back on that and think, okay, did we do her a disservice by not getting the extra help? I mean, she's an adult now, and graduated college, and did all these great things, but did we do her a disservice by ignoring it? We didn't really ignore it. We knew it was there, and we offered her accommodations in our home, but we denied the opportunity for her to get accommodations in school and in study. So what do you think about that? I mean, she's great, right?
So,
So,
yeah,
but
I mean, our understanding of all of this has changed so much in the last
right.
30
This
years.
has been 25 years, 25
Yeah.
years ago.
And I think the studies that have come out, so when I started researching this, the first thing that I looked at was like, what studies could I find for each of these different diagnoses? And the most prevalent studies are done around autism, right? But even those are fairly scant, and we're talking about less than a few dozen, right? So there's still a lot that we're learning, and a lot of the longer studies are just now finishing up in the last few years. So, the research on them are still coming out. They're very limited. It's very small sample sizes. So our understanding of the impacts of all of these things have changed quite a bit. And when your daughter was growing up, and when I was growing up, and when you were growing up, that don't ask, don't tell kind of mentality
Right.
was very
Right.
much the norm in a lot of areas. But the not to defend it, but the thought behind it was, you're creating a scenario where someone may feel like they have to mask, right, to be accepted. Well, all we were really doing was creating the mask for them, right? Now it's a
Right.
different thing. We understand, like, as of this year, and my research, which did address over 30,000 workers, one out of every 5 adults has some form of neurodivergence. One out of
Wow.
every 6 identify as having some kind of neurodivergence. One out of
Identify
every
as it, but there
identify.
may be some, like in the other 4 that don't know, like I didn't know.
Right,
I
right.
just
Like that.
assumed it my superpower. It wasn't labeled as, a disability.
Yeah,
So
there's actually not inclusive. So when you look at the other 4, 4.7% say that they're unsure, and 6.99 say choose not to disclose. And we know in surveying that people who say choose not to disclose are generally not no's, because if they were no's, they would just say no.
I
So,
I I never know how to answer that, now that I have this knowledge about myself, because is the organization really trying to accommodate for neurodiversity, or are they trying to eliminate a potential problem or an issue where
right.
they would have to accommodate, right?
So,
So I'm sure that I mean, I'm older, the later parts of my work life, clearly, but I'm sure that younger people really struggle
they
with,
do.
how
They
do I
do.
answer this? How do I answer this? How do I tell a potential employer or somebody that I'd like to partner with or work with that this is something that I have in my life? I don't want to say struggle with, because it's it's it is a struggle,
It is a
but
struggle, and
we
I think that's
you
fair.
you overcome it, and I don't wanna put words in other people's mouths. It's a struggle for me now. It
Yeah.
really is,
I
but it
think it's a
wasn't
struggle for
before.
everyone, to some degree, right? And it's certainly that's what we saw. That's what I saw in research, right? So when I
Okay.
went through the research, there was a couple of interesting things. One, when we asked the question quantitatively, what we saw is 1 in 10 were comfortable disclosing to their employer, which is an
Wow.
abysmal number, but
That
consistent
is.
with the research. Um, and then what was what was even more interesting and a little difficult to explain without showing the charts, is that the people that had quantitatively, affirmatively said, "Yes, I have neurodiagnosis," a neurodiagnosis, um, not all of them responded the same way in qualitative interview. And so when you looked at that variance, it didn't follow exactly. There's a reason for it. It's a response bias in qualitative interviews, but it has to relate to. It's easier to say what you think in writing or in a survey than it is to have to admit who you are to someone, and that has to do with a phenomenon called masking.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, that's a protective mechanism. And if you don't know someone and you don't know their intent and you don't know if you can trust them to help you, masking is a way that we can protect ourselves. And for people with neurodivergence, masking is something that they're, depending on the type of therapies they've had growing up and the conditions they have, masking is also something that's taught. Like in ABA therapy, for example, masking is conditioned, because you're taught what's socially acceptable in a response and behavior. And so that's part of the reason that ABA therapy is considered to be controversial, because
Wow.
you're teaching children generally to act contrary to who they actually are, and so you're teaching the concept of masking that then has to be unlearned as an adult so that they can properly advocate for themselves. So it's a tricky thing, right? Like on the one hand, that type of therapy can be very helpful in helping someone with autism integrate into society, because we do all have to function in society. But on the other hand, it can also be incredibly damaging because it's not helping them advocate for what they need to be able to regulate, emotionally speaking. It's teaching them what's going to be acceptable by the general population. And so it's troubling. But to answer your question, did you do the right thing? You did what was available. Like, you made the
Right.
decision that was available
Well,
based on
I was
what you
advised
had to
by
find.
an authority, right?
Right.
I was
And
advised by
that's
somebody who knew, who supposedly knew.
right. Well, and that's how we all make decisions, right?
Right.
Generally speaking, that's how most of us make decisions, is we try
That's true.
to find the best information we can and make the best decisions we can. So what we know now is that neurodiversity is complex, but it's also not insurmountable to accommodate, right? Like it's not that makes it sound like it's super hard. There's actually a lot of accommodations that are not terribly difficult to make that will help people be able to perform better in organizations. And so some of it is just education, right? But some of it is as easy as showing what your work environment looks like from jump. And we don't do that. And that was one of the questions that we asked in research was, do you recall seeing any information about neurodiversity during the recruiting process on the career site, anything that would help you understand as a neurodiverse person what it would be like to work in that organization? And I can tell you that 100% of the respondents did not choose yes. So 0% said yes,
Wow.
90% said no, and 9.6% said unsure. So no one said, yeah, I recall seeing that at any point through the recruiting process. And that's concerning, right? Because at the
Yeah.
very least, like you can look at things and recognize, like with very little research, like even just a quick look into Google search into how can I help ADHD workers, or what are some simple steps I can take to be more neuro-inclusive at work, right? Will show you things like show your office environment, right? If you've got an open office environment, that might be problematic for neurodiverse workers. That doesn't mean don't hire them, by the way.
Yeah, I know.
It means that you need
clearly
Yeah.
can clearly say, you got to turn that music down. I can't.
Right.
Or the
It means
noise.
that you
Right,
might need to have some accommodations, like letting them wear headphones, and
right,
sometimes
right.
a mix of over-the-ear headphones, so that if they have certain audio processing disorders, work better with over-the-ear headphones as opposed to in-ear headphones. So buying your team AirPods may seem cool, but might not actually be. Giving your employees choice works better.
Right,
Having focus
right.
areas, like even if it's just letting them use conference rooms to be able to separate
Love this.
noise around them. Like these are very low lift accommodations that are easy to make. But the
Most
first thing you
offices
do,
have this.
yeah, and the
Most
first
of
thing
them
you
have
do
it.
is just grab your smartphone, man. At this point, our smartphones are more than capable of taking pictures that are okay for social media and even our career sites. Take some pictures of your office environment so that people can self-determine, if I work here, am I going to need accommodations? Because also we found in research that the majority of people with neurodivergence were willing and able to self-accommodate. They just needed to know what they needed to accommodate for. And when you give them the
So
opportunity, they'll do it.
fascinating. Crystal, I think other people, maybe employers that are looking to, how can I do better?
Mhm.
They can reach out to someone like you that's done this kind of research,
Yeah,
and you can go in and give them advice. Yeah, let
absolutely.
me come and do a walkthrough through your office, and I can tell you what works, what isn't going to work. And I think that this is such an important part of this, because when I look back on my own history as a worker, working in an office environment where there were a lot of people all around me, the open office space, right? And because of my progression on, like, into an executive role, I was given an office. And when I went into the office environment outside of the center where all the workers were, I felt I did better work. Clearly I was doing good work because I was promoted to a position where I would have an office. But I was doing better work. I felt better about my work. I was less stressed because I had that, that quiet space to get work done in. We're not going to have enough time to cover everything that I wanted to cover. There's so much here, and I hope you'll come back. Before we
Yeah.
get away, I want to ask really quickly about media today, and this wasn't on the list of questions I sent you, but media today. As you were talking, I was thinking about Forrest Gump, right? The film Forrest Gump, and how Forrest as a child was labeled a certain way. And then there's that whole scene where he's running and he breaks out of the braces, and he's all of a sudden he's an athlete. And then, labeled as stupid as a child, stupid and limited because of his legs. Then all of a sudden we see him, launching a business, saving somebody in the war, all of these different things that he accomplished in the story, the life of Forrest Gump. And then we see films or shows like The Good Doctor, where autism is a central part, is the main character in the show. And I'm not talking about the actor or the character. I'm talking about the idea of autism is a main character in that show, and other shows that have helped the world to look in. Do you think that media like this, films or series or documentaries, helps, or does it set us back a little? Are we limiting perception by creating a perception?
It's both.
Or
It's
okay,
both. I mean, on the one hand, to use a line by Greg Fisher, no press is bad press. I mean, I don't know if that's true,
right,
but on the one
right,
hand, like, it drives awareness to it. And so when you drive awareness, it gets people thinking, and thinking is good, right? On the other hand, we'll pick on The Good Doctor for a second, which I have a love-hate relationship with, because
okay,
it's an interesting show, but there's so many things that they get wrong in it that
mm,
it's scary, because
right,
if someone didn't know, and this was their only insight into what autism is,
right, right,
that's scary because it's wrong, right? Like, or it there's a lot that's wrong. There's some things that are right, but there's a lot that's wrong, right? And so I think, as with most things in the media, you have to kind of take it like this is a grain of salt. And if you're interested in this, if this gets you thinking and you're intrigued, like, go find some credible people. And I brought this book today to make
there you
sure
go.
that I could, and I'm doing a horrible job of putting it up here because I don't
No,
know where my camera's
there you
at.
go. Perfect, perfect.
There we go. Pete Warmby, Untypical. Like, I love this book, and I recommend it probably once a week. If you want to
Great.
understand
I'll
autism.
add that to the bio or in the comments of the show, because I think it's so important. One of my questions I always ask at the end of these conversations is resources. What are some resources that you can share? So we'll make sure to share that, plus the author and where people can get it. I'm sure it's available on Amazon.
Yeah,
Um,
it is.
I,
But so my point was, whatever the condition is, whether it's lupus, whether it's ADHD, autism, whatever it is, there are, like, actual you know um, experts in the field that have written books to help you understand what this is and what the implications of it are. And so, like, do I like the fact that it's showing an autistic person being able to be a doctor? Absolutely. Is it realistic? Probably not. I mean, the chances of someone, like, the stuff that the show shows, like, is that really realistic? No, probably not.
right.
So, I think you have to kind of look at that stuff and say, this is a jumping off point for me to be able to learn more. And there are a lot of resources to learn more. If you are a parent with a child, especially a child that's a teenager moving into adulthood, get connected to vocational rehab in your state. That's so critical. And schools are supposed to connect you with it, but not enough of them connect you early enough.
And we all know you have to be your own advocate.
You
You
do.
have to be your own child's
You
advocate, whether it's in healthcare or mental health care or any kind of diagnosis anywhere or in school. You have to be.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
I know I had to be. I know you've had to be. So it's critical to stay
thank you.
involved and understand what's available, and if it's not available, push for availability.
Yeah, at
Push to have it
16,
done.
your child is eligible for transition services, like, to start that process. It shouldn't be done in your child's senior year. That's not enough time. So start connecting with them at 16. There's a lot of resources there. Also, there's, if you are the parent of a child with disabilities, hidden or otherwise, but intellectual disabilities and learning disabilities particularly, there's a program that's called, Partners in Policymaking. It's available in almost every state. It's a free program. It's usually run by your state's disability program. So, look for that. You can Google it. You can also take it online for free. But it'll
Wow.
connect you with all of the resources in your state. If you're an employer, you can also connect to vocational rehabilitation. And one of the biggest problems that people with disabilities have, physical or intellectual, is unemployment and underemployment. And as a diversity population, people with disabilities are more impacted than almost any other population, and they are combined the largest minority population and one of the most severely impacted. The number of people that live in poverty who are disabled is just stunning. And so, as an employer, you have the ability to be able to help that. So connect with VR. There are tax benefits for you. So, there's a benefit to you as well, but connect with them and like let them know, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. They'll work with you. They provide job coaches to be able to help people with disabilities integrate within your organization. There are people like me who can help you understand. There are other people. I have a list of people that this is what they do all day, every day. So please feel free to reach out. Happy to help.
So much information, Crystal. We didn't get to a part that I want to talk to you about in the future, which is we talked briefly about it, accommodations in the workplace, and how organizations, employers can be more aware, have a little bit more empathy. What are some other things that can be done? And I apologize for, we've got somebody that's saying, hey, Crystal, would love to talk to you more about the unemployment data and stats. And then we had another comment here on LinkedIn. Love this topic. The organization I work for is usually part of a grant national challenge where we are developing toolkits and resources for companies, schools, employees, students, families to address these issues and concerns. Thank you, those on LinkedIn that were tuning in and sharing these ideas. Love this. We'll go back and respond to you on LinkedIn. The platform that I use here no longer shares names of the individuals that are commenting. So we'll go back and make sure that we address those comments. And I want to apologize to you personally, Crystal, for popping that comment up while you were talking, because I know that's distracting. For me, I would have been, should I read it? Should I? So I apologize for popping that up. I just wanted to make sure that we got to it and didn't miss it.
No, that's fantastic. I'm happy to come back again.
Oh, great. That was what I was going to just ask you. I would love that. I would love to have you back. I know there's the couple of things. I want to talk about accommodations specifically. And then also the school resources that you shared. We'll make sure that those are available on the LinkedIn and on Facebook. This also streamed on Facebook. So I know individuals on Facebook aren't able to ask questions live like this. And I want to cover your research when it is available. Please let us know. I'd love to have you back. I am so fascinated by this topic for a number of reasons, mostly because I'm really in a place in my life where I want to understand and assist and support individuals that are different than me or are different than everybody else. And the more that I learn, the more that I study, this idea of atypical is it really atypical? I mean, the more people I talk to, the more people are recognizing that they have a diverse part of their being, whether it's, if it's something health-wise, physical, if it's I don't hate to call it an ailment too, because I've really throughout my life, I considered what I struggled with and overcame for a while as a superpower. And shows like X-Men or, even superheroes, when we think about them, as a child, you looked at these individuals and said, oh my gosh, they have superpowers, right? And I think if we come to a place where we recognize that these are superpowers, we do have different abilities. We all have different abilities where we're really good at something and I'm really crappy at a lot of things. Those aren't my superpowers. So I'd like to partner with and speak with and chat with individuals that have those superpowers so that I can appreciate them more and have that in my life. We have one more comment. Let's see. These comments are from me, Amir. Oh, hi, Amir. Thanks, Amir. Great. Thanks. I appreciate you sharing your name here and appreciate you tuning in. It's been such a great pleasure, Crystal, to have you here. I know we went way over time than I wanted to, but it's so important to have these conversations and to recognize diversity all around us. Any last resource you can share or last comment, or are we good till the next time?
I mean, I think we're any of these above, but I would say your comment about typicality kind of made me think about something, and that's again how we label things, right? I said in the beginning, neurotypical and neurodiverse and neurodivergent tend to that's almost becoming outdated in and of itself.
Right.
I'll leave you with this. What we're talking about right now is the neurominority and the neuromajority. And right now, people who have quote unquote neurotypical functioning are the neuromajority. I suspect as we understand more about the diversity of the brain over time, that might flip. So, but if we look at neurominority and neuromajority, it might even help us in the way that we accommodate. I had a conversation this week with, and I've had this conversation many times, but with the crew at Illinois SHRM, where we were talking about this topic. And one of the things that came up just before my session was a conversation about how like it's hard to get leaders to buy into accommodations. I was like, what do you mean? Like, tell me more. Well, it's hard to get them to want to do the work and put the funds in for us to be able to properly accommodate people. And I said, okay, I'm going to leave you with this uncomfortable exercise that I'm totally going to repeat in session, and I'm going to repeat it to you here. It's super uncomfortable. Are you ready for it?
Yeah, I think.
Okay. So we're gonna play an uncomfortable game, and I want you to tell me if this sentence is acceptable. And it's a series of sentences.
Okay.
I just don't know if I can get my leaders to buy in to accommodating this pregnant woman.
Whew, no.
I just don't know if I can get this team to accommodate this Black person.
No, not acceptable.
So if those sentences are not acceptable, and if the sentence of, yeah, I don't really know if our organization is ready for same-sex partners.
Yeah, not acceptable.
So if those aren't acceptable, why would it be acceptable to say, I don't know if our organization is ready to accommodate someone with autism or ADHD
Right.
or dyspraxia or dyslexia or any of the other disabilities or lupus? Like the answer is it's not. It's
not
just as
acceptable.
protected. So we got to do the work.
Right. Right. That's a perfect way to wrap this conversation, Crystal. I can't thank you enough for sharing what you have learned. And I'm really looking forward to your research, and congratulations on your dissertation and all the great things that you're accomplishing now. I feel like I am so blessed and lucky and fortunate to have you in my circle of friends and peers and colleagues and influence. I really appreciate what you have learned and how you're distributing it and sharing it and bringing it to folks that are wondering. They're wondering about this and want to know more. And so thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see you back next time.
Thanks, Rayanne.